The thickness of the concrete at the base of the dam, the height of it, 180 meters, and it's 2 kilometers long, so it's a colossal amount of concrete.
High on the Tibetan Plateau, more than 10,000 feet above sea level, the air is thin, the wind cuts through like ice, and the landscape feels almost untouched.
So to break the deadlock, engineers began work on the world's biggest dam. It would contain more concrete than any other construction project before it.
Right here, under the quiet stare of the Himalayas, one of the most daring construction projects in the world got underway. Giant cranes rose against the cold sky. Long convoys of trucks slowly climbed winding mountain roads loaded with concrete. And there, at 10,000 feet, China began pouring massive amounts of concrete into a remote riverbed, not to stop the flow, but to completely reshape the land. What followed shocked not only local residents, but also scientists, engineers, and environmental experts around the world. This wasn't just about building a dam, it was making a bold point. And in the chapters ahead, we'll explore what really happened, how it came together, what it revealed, and why the effects of this high-altitude project may still be playing out. A river, a ridge, and a race against gravity. The Yarlung Tsangpo River winds quietly through the high Tibetan Plateau, and it's one of Asia's most powerful rivers. Nicknamed the Everest of Rivers, it begins near Mount Kailash in western Tibet, then cuts deep through the Himalayas before taking a sharp turn and flowing into India, where it becomes the massive Brahmaputra. It's a lifeline for millions downstream and a powerful force at its wild, remote source. This river is no ordinary waterway. Along its path is Asia's own version of the Grand Canyon, a hidden, dramatic gorge where cliffs drop thousands of feet into rushing rapids. Few have been there, and even fewer have studied it up close. The terrain is rough, the weather harsh, and the altitude makes every move harder. But it was right here, at nearly 10,000 feet, that China decided to launch one of its boldest engineering efforts. A giant hydropower project that would take years, huge amounts of concrete, and a direct challenge to both nature and politics. The plan itself wasn't a brand new idea. China has been building dams for decades. From the giant Three Gorges Dam on the Yangtze River to smaller projects tucked into the country's western provinces, the country has poured major funding into hydropower as part of its clean energy goals. It's part of a bigger push tied to growing industries, getting power to rural areas, and supporting long-term environmental plans. But the Yarlung Tsangpo came with problems no other project had faced. First, the land. This area sits right where tectonic plates meet, an active earthquake zone. Rock slides are common and the soil is loose. The riverbanks are steep, so engineers had to get creative just to build solid ground for their heavy machines. They weren't only fighting water pressure, they had to deal with the mountain itself. One small mistake, and the whole structure could shift or break apart. And then, there's the altitude. At 10,000 feet, everything slows down. At this altitude, even basic work becomes tough. Workers needed oxygen just to function normally. Machines ran slower. And because of the cold, dry air, concrete didn't set the way it usually does. Every load of materials had to travel up narrow switchback roads cut into steep cliff sides. Every batch of cement had to be closely monitored for temperature to make sure it cured properly. But the physical strain wasn't the only concern. There were big environmental questions too. The Yarlung Tsangpo is home to plant and animal species found nowhere else in the world. It feeds glaciers, supports tiny remote villages, and eventually flows into India's river systems. Any shift in water flow or sediment could affect areas far beyond Tibet. Environmental experts inside and outside China raised flags. Was the energy payoff worth these long-term risks? So why build here at all? From the planner's point of view, this site offered something no other place could: unmatched hydropower potential. The elevation drop at the Yarlung Tsangpo Grand Canyon is one of the steepest anywhere on Earth. If they could harness it, the energy output would be massive, more than many lowland rivers combined. It also lined up with China's larger goals around energy independence and reducing its reliance on coal. But chasing clean energy in a place like this meant racing against gravity, the terrain, and time. Success wasn't just about pouring concrete, it meant engineering against nature itself. And when that first load of concrete touched the river at 10,000 feet, no one, not even the people building it, fully knew what would happen next. Pouring concrete at this height feels almost unreal. At 10,000 feet above sea level, nothing behaves the way it's supposed to. The air is thin, engines strain, and even basic tasks require extra effort and care. But in the cold shadows of the Himalayas, Chinese engineers kicked off one of the most complex builds ever attempted. Thousands of tons of concrete were poured straight into a live river running through the mountains. This wasn't your average construction site. The area could only be reached by narrow mountain roads. Heavy equipment had to be taken apart, hauled up in pieces, and put back together at the top. Cement trucks were insulated to deal with freezing temperatures, and each batch had to be timed carefully so it would set without cracking or failing. They couldn't even use standard concrete. The team developed a special high-altitude formula that cured slower and held up against the sudden cold snaps that hit without warning. It had to be pumped down long metal tubes that snaked deep into the canyon, where the concrete met fast-moving water and sheer rock walls. Normal materials wouldn't have lasted even a day here, but that was just the start. One of the hardest parts was temporarily redirecting part of the river. It had to be done safely and without harming areas downstream. Engineers used strong barriers and smart drainage designs to hold back small sections of the river just long enough to lay the groundwork. At the same time, satellite systems and sensors on-site tracked every change in water movement to avoid sudden shifts that could put workers or the project at risk. At the heart of all this was the dam's key feature: vertical drop modules. These weren't just large blocks. They were stacked concrete cells built to hold back water from above and channel it faster below. This design helped reduce sediment buildup and let engineers guide the river's force with more control. Picture a series of underwater steps, each one built to hold back, guide, and control the extreme force of moving water. That's basically what these vertical drop modules were. But they weren't working alone. The containment walls were just as critical. Double reinforced concrete layers spaced throughout the structure, made to handle sudden rock movement. These walls were slightly flexible under stress, lined with steel mesh, and held in place by titanium anchors drilled deep into the mountain. And every piece of it had to come together quickly. Conditions were brutal. The cold made tools crack. The altitude wore people down fast, causing fatigue, headaches, even problems with basic coordination. Many workers had to rotate out every 10 days. Cement trucks had to hit exact delivery windows within minutes of mixing, or the material would be useless. Drones helped with some inspections, but in the end, most of it came down to hands-on work, careful, steady, and incredibly risky. But the most impressive part wasn't the concrete or the gear. It was the coordination. Hundreds of specialists, experts in engineering, geology, environment, and logistics, all working together in sync. A single delay in materials or one wrong pour could have caused a crack or fault that would undo months of progress. But somehow they pulled it off. When the last concrete pylons were placed on one of the smaller dams, an engineer reportedly said, "It's over." But was it really? On the surface, yes. The first section was complete. That smaller structure opened the path for the massive build that would one day channel the full power of the river. Energy was already beginning to shift toward turbines still under construction. But even as the teams packed up and left, small changes were being noticed. Downstream, sediment levels dropped. Villagers began to see snow melting earlier than expected. And far from the mountains, scientists were watching closely. Because when you build into a live, wild river at the top of the world, you don't always get to control what comes next. Then came the moment everything shifted. For weeks, things had gone almost perfectly. The concrete held. Water was flowing the way engineers intended. On paper, it looked like a win, proof that this kind of extreme construction could actually work. But then, on a cold, clear morning just after the final section was locked in place, something changed. It started small. Sensors picked up unusual pressure changes under the waterline. The underground water flow was speeding up, barely at first, but enough to raise flags. Within hours, satellite images confirmed what no one on the ground had seen yet. The riverbed had moved, and it wasn't slowing down. Less than 48 hours after the final slabs were set, a huge wall of sediment located far downstream suddenly gave way. It hadn't been built by people. It was a natural dam formed over decades from glacier melt and packed soil. And just like that, it collapsed. No tools, no explosions, just pressure doing what pressure does. What came next wasn't a disaster, but it was fast. Water surged through dry canyons, cutting new paths and flooding spots that had never seen water before. Villages far from the build site watched their riverbanks rise. Irrigation systems failed under the weight of the unexpected flow. People didn't have time to react. "We didn't hear anything, just animals running," one farmer said. Then we looked up and saw the river moving in a way we'd never seen before. It looked angrier, higher. Nearby, construction crews at the main dam site were quickly pulled back to safer ground. No one was hurt, but the mood changed instantly, from proud success to quiet concern. The engineers had followed every rule, every standard. So why did nature suddenly shift the outcome? Within hours, a team of hydrologists and geologists was flown in. Using drones, sonar, and satellite thermal imaging, they started analyzing the river. What they found was surprising, not because something had gone wrong structurally, but because something larger had been set in motion. The massive, well-placed concrete had acted like a final piece in a much older puzzle. It didn't break anything, it just nudged pressure in the right way to unsettle older formations, setting off a chain of events underground. The river simply responded with new, unpredictable force. The strange part? This wasn't officially classified as a disaster. No one died. Nothing man-made was destroyed. But in scientific terms, it was a major event. Satellite images picked up sudden changes in land temperature, plant coverage, and sediment buildup, all within 3 days. And things weren't settling. The pressure shift sparked new effects. Pools of water collected in strange places, causing microflooding in small ecosystems nearby. Valleys that had never held water before briefly turned into lakes, only to vanish days later. Some fish disappeared from usual feeding zones, raising concerns for local ecologists. Conservation teams started watching birds more closely, worried their feeding habits might be affected. To the outside world, the dam still stood tall, and the skies stayed calm. But it was a quiet warning. In the thin air of the high mountains, where nature meets human design, full control is a myth. Once you push the balance, even gently, you don't get to choose what happens next. Science went into overdrive. Within days of the Yarlung Changpo's unexpected shift, experts around the world took notice. Something was off. A ripple had passed through one of Asia's most critical water sources. The next step was clear. Figure out what happened and what might still happen. Hydrologists, climate scientists, and geologists from different countries dug into the satellite data. They studied heat maps, water clarity, and ground movement. What they found first was unsettling. The riverbed had shifted, not by much, but just enough to speed up the flow in some narrow bends downstream. A small change, but with a big reach. Because this river eventually becomes the Brahmaputra, the effect didn't stay inside China. In India, scientists began noticing small but unusual changes in water levels along distant streams and offshoots. It wasn't flooding, but it wasn't normal either. Teams from the Indian Institute of Remote Sensing started comparing the latest data with previous years, looking at glacier melt, river speed, and sediment travel across hundreds of kilometers. What they found was a complicated pattern. The pressure from the dam had created short-term acceleration zones, forcing water faster through tight valleys, then spreading it out as it moved lower. For some villages, this meant earlier than usual irrigation. Others dealt with minor soil loss from water flowing harder than expected. One rice farmer in Assam put it simply, "It's not a flood, it's not a drought, but it's not the same." And when the water behaves differently, everything else has to adjust. At the same time, climate researchers saw an opportunity. For once, they could test their simulation models in real time. They ran fluid dynamics tests to see how even tiny changes in water speed or sediment flow might ripple out and affect the environment more widely. The early data raised eyebrows. If the current trends held, parts of the riverbanks in lower Assam and even Bangladesh could reshape themselves within the next 10 years, not through erosion, but from changes in how the river moves. In response, Chinese scientists began internal assessments and released technical updates to calm growing speculation. Public statements stressed that the dam was structurally sound and that everything was operating safely. But even in those official updates, there were quiet admissions. Water flow patterns downstream had shifted in ways no one planned for. That alone raised concerns, not just for China, but for India, Nepal, and Bangladesh, all downstream from the Yarlung Tsangpo and its continuation as the Brahmaputra. Meanwhile, the story spread. Scientific journals began highlighting the project as a rare case study, where a high-altitude build had created changes that rippled across borders. And through all the articles and discussions, one question quietly echoed. If one dam can cause this, what happens if more are built? A dam or a warning? When engineers first pitched the Yarlung Tsangpo hydro project, the idea was straightforward: capture one of the world's steepest river drops and turn it into clean power. But after the river began shifting downstream, the story started to shift too. What began as a high-tech accomplishment slowly became a conversation about limits. Was this dam a win for innovation or a signal that nature had limits of its own? From a technical view, the build was a success. The concrete stayed strong. The turbines ran. No breakdowns, no urgent shutdowns. Yet, what came after, rising pressure, fast-moving sediment, and water behavior that crossed borders, told a different kind of story. Environmental planners started using a new term: systems thinking. They described the Himalayan watershed as something alive, always moving, reacting, and deeply linked. If you build on a fault line, one scientist said, you don't just get earthquakes, you get tremors, social, ecological, and everything in between. China has long believed that building infrastructure can unlock development. Roads, rail lines, bridges, and especially dams have helped remote regions grow. The Three Gorges Dam is the country's most iconic example, and also its most debated. But this dam in the Himalayas felt different. It wasn't about powering a major city. It was about pushing the boundary. Could you pour thousands of tons of concrete into a river so high up in the world and expect everything to stay the same? The answer, it seems, is yes, but only kind of. The dam didn't fail, but what came next wasn't simple. It was messy. It was a new river path, pressure in fragile ecosystems, and lingering questions about how far we can go before the Earth answers back. These questions aren't theoretical anymore. The Himalayas are a sensitive region, not just in terms of geography, but politics. The rivers here connect several nations, tied together by shared culture and deep history. When one country changes the path of the water, physically or symbolically, it can shift more than just the river. And then comes the ethical side of it. Should we build in places where the margin for error is this slim, where we're using cutting-edge tools but still can't guarantee the outcome? The Yarlung Tsangpo Dam shows what human effort can achieve, but also reminds us that nature always has the last word. The engineers who built it still back the project. They highlight the renewable energy gains, the reduced need for coal, and the improved access to power in remote parts of Tibet. And all of that is true and important. So, what now? On paper, the project is complete. The dust has settled, the concrete is set, and the smaller Yarlung Tsangpo Dam is fully operational. But the story doesn't end there, not for the scientists tracking flow changes, not for nearby countries watching closely, and definitely not for those planning the future of large-scale builds in hard-to-reach places. While China marks the success of this engineering milestone, signs already point to more projects ahead. Satellite scans and public records suggest possible future dams in nearby sections of the river. These would be smaller, but part of a larger plan to fully tap into Tibet's hydro potential. If that vision comes to life, the region could provide up to 15% of China's total hydropower output. And that possibility has raised flags far beyond China's borders. In India, Bhutan, and Nepal, environmental groups and engineering alliances are now calling for joint discussions before any more construction begins. Their worry isn't based on rejection, it's based on not knowing. What happened at 10,000 feet changed water flow across 3 countries in less than a week. If one dam can do that, what happens when there are 3 or 5? There are also deeper geological concerns. High mountain building comes with risks that aren't fully mapped. Underground water, fault line pressures, and layers of frozen soil, permafrost, behave differently under stress in places like this. And that makes the next steps anything but simple. At the same time, global conversations around development are shifting. Big investors, including development banks and infrastructure funds, are starting to ask harder questions about how climate change and shared water sources affect these kinds of projects. The World Hydrology Council has already added the Yarlung Tsangpo case to its 2025 list of emerging global risk studies. It's not seen as a failure, but as a live example of what even the best modern engineering can't always predict. And public awareness is growing fast. Environmental groups, science publications, and online communities have all picked up the story. University classes, short documentaries, and forums are now using it to show how even a single, well-planned concrete pour can spark a worldwide conversation. What do you think will happen when the final Yarlung Tsangpo megadam becomes fully operational? Could it lead to rising tensions between neighboring countries over control of shared water sources? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and stay tuned for more deep dives into world-changing projects and discoveries.